Morning arrived without ceremony, the way it always did in the house, quiet, measured, and indifferent to whoever happened to be awake first. The light slipped in through narrow windows and fell across the stone floor in pale, patient bands. He rose before the bell, as he had learned to do, careful not to disturb the hush that clung to the rooms at this hour. The air smelled faintly of soap and old wood. He washed his hands, tied the cord at his waist, and moved down the corridor with practiced steps that made no sound. Years of learning where boards creaked and where shadows gathered had taught him how to pass through a place as if he were part of it, unnoticed and expected, like the ticking of a clock. The master's house was large, built for permanence. Its walls were thick, its ceilings high, its doors heavy. Everything about it suggested endurance, the kind that outlived names and faces. He had come to understand that the house itself demanded a certain kind of behavior, steady, restrained, efficient. It rewarded those who learned its rhythms and punished those who resisted them. He had learned quickly. In the early days, mistakes cost more than pride. Now his body knew what to do before his thoughts caught up, and that knowledge kept him safe. His work began in the private rooms. He entered them with his eyes lowered, not from fear alone, but from habit. Looking too long at anything that was not meant for him had once been corrected with sharp words and sharper consequences. So he looked at the floor, at the corners of furniture, at the places where dust collected and had to be removed. He learned to read the room through reflection and sound, the way a curtain moved when the window was opened, a faint scrape of a chair leg that told him someone had passed through earlier. These small signs mattered. They told him how carefully he needed to work, how invisible he needed to be. The bed was always first. It stood at the center of the room, broad and heavy, draped in linens that smelled of lavender. Fixing it was not difficult, but it required care. He smoothed the sheets until no crease remained, pulled the blanket tight, aligned the pillows so their edges formed a straight line. There was a certain satisfaction in the order it created, a brief sense that something had been made right, even if only temporarily. He did not linger on that feeling. Lingering invited trouble. He worked, stepped back, checked his work, and adjusted anything that looked imperfect. As he worked, his thoughts stayed quiet. He had learned to keep them that way. Thinking too much led to remembering, and remembering led to longing. Longing was dangerous. It made the hours heavier and the days longer. Instead, he counted movements, measured breaths, focused on the small tasks that filled his time, the sound of fabric sliding under his hands, the soft thud of a pillow settling into place. These were safe things to notice. He had been in the house long enough to know its moods. Some days it felt tense, like a held breath, and on those days he moved faster, spoke less. Other days it felt merely watchful, and he allowed himself to slow just enough to do his work well. Today felt ordinary, which was a kind of blessing. Ordinary days passed without incident. Ordinary days ended with him returning to his small room, tired but unhurt. There were other servants in the house, but they moved like planets on separate paths. Their work rarely overlapped, and when it did, conversation was brief and cautious. Everyone understood that words carried weight here. A careless sentence could be repeated, twisted, used. Silence was safer. He had learned to communicate with glances and gestures, with a nod or a slight shift of the shoulders. These small languages passed unnoticed by those who did not need them. He finished the bed and turned to the rest of the room. The chair needed straightening, the table dusting. He worked methodically, moving from one task to the next without pause. The sun climbed higher, and the light in the room grew stronger, revealing every speck he might have missed. He caught them all. Missing something would mean returning later, and returning later meant questions. As he bent to smooth the edge of the rug, he caught his reflection in the polished wood of the dresser. It was not something he sought out, but sometimes it appeared unexpectedly, and he had learned not to flinch. He saw what others saw when they looked at him, even if they rarely said it aloud. A face that did not carry the marks of hardship as heavily as it might have, features that drew the eye. He did not think of this as a gift. In this place, being noticed was rarely a blessing. Attention could turn quickly, and not always kindly. He straightened and stepped back. The room looked as it should, orderly, calm, untouched by the labor that had gone into it. That was the goal, to leave no trace of himself behind. He paused only long enough to listen, making sure no one was approaching, then moved toward the door. His work here was done. The corridor beyond was cooler, the stone holding the night's chill. He walked it with the same care, aware of every sound. Somewhere deeper in the house voices murmured. He could not make out the words, and he did not try. Understanding too much was another kind of risk. He focused instead on the next task waiting for him, the next room that needed tending. Yet even as he moved on, a faint sense of unease followed him, though he could not have said why. Perhaps it was simply the way the morning light had caught his reflection, or the way the house seemed a little too quiet, as if listening. He pushed the feeling aside. There was no room for it in his day. There was only work. He had learned over time that the house did not care who he was beyond what he could provide. It measured him in completed tasks and unbroken rules. His worth was tied to how well he disappeared into his duties. That understanding shaped everything he did, every choice he made. It was not something he questioned anymore. Questioning led nowhere. By midday, the rhythm of the house shifted. The quiet of early morning gave way to movement, to footsteps and doors opening and closing. He adjusted his pace accordingly, staying out of the way, making himself small. When he passed others, he kept his eyes lowered, his expression neutral. Neutrality was another form of protection. The memory of the bed, of the smooth sheets and careful lines, stayed with him longer than it should have. It was nothing, he told himself, just another task, one of hundreds he performed each week. Still it lingered, perhaps because it represented a brief moment of control in a life where so much was decided for him. He had made something orderly. He had left it better than he found it. That had to be enough. As the day wore on, fatigue settled into his bones, a familiar weight. He welcomed it. Tiredness dulled the edges of thought, made it easier to focus on the present moment. By the time the evening approached, his movements were slower, but no less careful. He finished his last task and returned to his small room at the back of the house, closing the door softly behind him. There, in the narrow space that was his alone, he allowed himself a deeper breath. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall, letting the day drain out of him. Tomorrow would be the same, he knew. The same rooms, the same routines, the same careful steps. There was comfort in that predictability, even if it was a fragile comfort. He lay back and closed his eyes, the image of the morning room fading into darkness. The house settled around him, its sounds familiar and distant. For now there was nothing more required of him. For now he could rest. The afternoon light had shifted by the time he was sent back to the private rooms. It was not unusual for work to return him there more than once in a day. The house was exacting, and exactness required revisiting what had already been done. Still, the summons tightened something in his chest. He did not question it. Questions were not his to ask. He simply wiped his hands on his cloth, smoothed his expression into the calm neutrality expected of him, and followed the corridor back toward the center of the house. The room looked almost the same as it had in the morning, though the sun now fell at a different angle, casting longer shadows across the floor. The air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of the day's heat. He paused at the doorway, listening. Silence answered him. Satisfied, he stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. His task was simple: adjust the bed again, make sure nothing had shifted. It felt redundant, but redundancy was part of the house's nature. He moved toward the bed and placed his hands on the edge of the blanket, smoothing it as he had before. The fabric was still neat, his earlier work intact. He allowed himself a small inward nod of approval and continued, lifting a pillow to straighten it. That was when he sensed it, someone else's presence. It was not a sound so much as a change in the room's weight, a subtle pressure that made the air feel different. He froze, heart thudding once, then steadied himself. Slowly he turned his head just enough to see. She stood near the window, partially turned away, light outlining her figure. He had not heard her enter. That, too, was not unusual. The house allowed certain people to move without announcement. He lowered his gaze immediately, eyes settling on the floor. His posture shifted instinctively, shoulders drawing in, making himself smaller. "I didn't realize anyone was here," she said. Her voice was calm, not sharp. That alone unsettled him. He bowed his head slightly, the gesture automatic. "Forgive me," he replied quietly. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if it belonged to someone else. She did not dismiss him, nor did she leave. There was a pause long enough for his thoughts to crowd in despite his efforts to keep them at bay. Pauses were dangerous. Pauses invited attention. "You were fixing the bed," she said, more observation than accusation. "Yes," he answered. He did not add anything else. Adding things led to mistakes. She stepped closer, and though he kept his eyes down, he was acutely aware of the movement. The space between them felt suddenly smaller, charged with something he could not name. He focused on his breathing, slow and steady, the way he had learned to do when tension threatened to overwhelm him. "You do it very carefully," she continued. He hesitated, unsure whether a response was required. Compliments were rare and often carried hidden edges. Still, silence could be read as insolence. He chose the safest path he knew. "I try to do my work well." Another pause followed. He could almost feel her gaze on him, weighing, assessing. He resisted the urge to shift his feet or fidget. Stillness was safer. "Look up," she said. The words landed heavily, though they were spoken without force. He swallowed and obeyed, lifting his eyes just enough to meet her face. He did not stare. Staring was forbidden. But in that brief glance, he saw curiosity rather than anger, and that confused him more than hostility would have. She studied him openly, as if he were an object placed before her for inspection. He stood there, hands at his sides, expression carefully blank. Inside, his thoughts raced. Had he done something wrong? Had he missed something this morning? He searched his memory, replaying every movement, every detail of his work. "You're different from the others," she said, finally. The statement hung between them, ambiguous and dangerous. He did not know how to respond, so he did not. Silence, again, seemed safest. She moved past him toward the bed, running her hand lightly over the smooth surface of the blanket. "You take pride in what you do," she said, almost to herself. He nodded once, uncertain. Pride was not a word often applied to him. Pride implied ownership, and he owned nothing here, not even his own time. As she stood there, something shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable. It was not courage. He knew better than to mistake it for that. It was more like a momentary loosening of the tight constraints he kept around his thoughts. Perhaps it was the ordinary tone of her voice, or the way the afternoon light softened the room, making it feel less like a place of rules and more like a place where people lived. Whatever the cause, it unsettled the careful balance. E had maintained for so long. He noticed then, with a clarity that surprised him, how the light touched her face, how the lines of her expression softened when she was not speaking. It was not something he had ever allowed himself to consider before. Noticing such things served no purpose and invited danger. Yet the thought came unbidden, and once present, it refused to disappear. She turned back toward him, catching his gaze before he could lower it again. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. The words escaped him before he had time to stop them. "You're beautiful, you know that?" The moment they were spoken, he knew he had crossed a line. The realization hit him like cold water, stealing his breath. His heart began to pound and his mouth went dry. He dropped his gaze instantly, every muscle in his body tensing as he waited for the consequences he was certain would follow. The silence that followed was different from any he had known. It was not the sharp, expectant quiet of impending punishment, nor the dismissive silence that ended a conversation. It was heavy, uncertain, filled with something unspoken. Seconds stretched, each one amplifying his fear. He replayed the sentence in his mind, horrified at his own recklessness. Where had it come from? He had never spoken to her that way, had never spoken to anyone that way here. The rules were clear, ingrained over years of careful obedience. He had broken them in an instant, undone by a thought he should never have allowed himself to have. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I shouldn't have. Please forgive me." Still she did not respond. He could feel her presence, close and unmoving. His hands clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. He braced himself, ready for anger, for reprimand, for anything that would restore the familiar order of things. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "No one has ever said that to me like that." He did not know what that meant, and the uncertainty frightened him more than certainty would have. He remained still, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting. "I didn't ask you to speak," she continued, but there was no harshness in her tone. "Yet you did." "Yes," he said faintly. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why was not something he had been asked about his words before? He searched for an answer that would protect him, that would fit within the narrow confines of safety he understood. None came easily. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it felt like another risk. She exhaled softly, a sound that might have been a sigh. "You should be more careful," she said. "Yes," he agreed immediately. "It won't happen again." Another pause followed, shorter this time. Then she stepped back, increasing the distance between them. The room seemed to breathe again. "You may go," she said. Relief flooded him so suddenly it left him weak. He bowed his head, murmured his thanks, and moved toward the door without looking back. Only when he was safely in the corridor did he allow himself to release the breath he had been holding. As he walked away, his legs trembled slightly, the delayed reaction to the fear he had suppressed. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on the familiar pattern of the stone beneath his shoes. The house closed around him once more, its rules reasserting themselves. Yet something had changed. He could feel it, a faint but persistent echo of the moment in the room. The words he had spoken replayed in his mind, not with the same terror as before, but with a strange mix of disbelief and clarity. He had spoken a truth as he saw it, without calculation or permission. The realization unsettled him deeply. He knew the danger of such moments. He knew how quickly they could turn against him. And yet, as he disappeared back into the rhythm of his work, he could not entirely regret what had been said. For better or worse, the silence that had defined his life had been broken, if only for a heartbeat. The hours that followed passed in a haze of motion and restraint. He completed his remaining tasks with the same care he always did, but his thoughts refused to settle. They circled back, again and again, to the moment in the room, the stillness, the words, the look on her face after he spoke. He told himself it was dangerous to dwell on it, that memory itself could become a liability. Yet the mind does not always obey commands, especially when something rare has disturbed its usual order. He washed his hands more than necessary, scrubbing as if he could erase the echo of his own voice from his skin. The water ran cold, numbing his fingers, and he welcomed the sensation. Physical discomfort was easier to manage than the tight knot in his chest. Each repetition of the day's routines was an attempt to return to normal, to convince himself that nothing had changed. But the effort itself betrayed the truth. Something had. He avoided the private rooms for the rest of the afternoon, grateful when his duties kept him elsewhere. The farther he was from that space, the safer he felt. Still, the house had a way of folding moments back on themselves. Every corridor seemed to lead him past familiar doors. Every silence reminded him of the one that followed his words. He moved carefully, as always, but with an added layer of caution, as if the walls themselves might be listening more closely now. By evening, fatigue pressed heavily on him. The physical tiredness was familiar. It was the mental strain that felt new. When he finally returned to his small room, he closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut, breathing slow and deliberate. The room was dim, lit only by the fading light from a narrow window. It offered little comfort, but it was his refuge, such as it was. He sat on the edge of his bed and let his head fall into his hands. The memory surfaced unbidden, her standing by the window, the way the light traced her outline, the surprise that flickered across her face. He replayed the moment from every angle, searching for what he might have missed, for some sign that would tell him how to understand it. Had she been angry, curious, hurt? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had spent his life learning how to read others for survival, how to anticipate moods, how to avoid attention. This was different. This was not a threat he could clearly define, nor an opportunity he dared to consider. It was a question without an answer, and that unsettled him more than any reprimand could have. Sleep came slowly that night. When it did, it was shallow, filled with fragments of the day that surfaced and dissolved without warning. He dreamed of the house shifting shape, corridors narrowing and widening, doors appearing where none had been before. He woke before dawn, heart racing, unsure whether he had rested at all. The next morning began as the last had, with quiet and routine. He rose, washed, and set to his tasks with renewed determination to be invisible. He avoided looking at reflective surfaces, avoided lingering anywhere he might be seen. He told himself that the safest course was to behave as if the moment had never occurred. The house valued consistency, he would give it nothing else. Yet consistency did not erase awareness. As the day unfolded, he noticed small changes, perhaps imagined, perhaps not. A glance held a fraction longer than usual, a pause in conversation that seemed to stretch just a bit. He could not be sure whether these were consequences of his imagination, or signs of something shifting beneath the surface of daily life. When his work took him near the private rooms again, his steps slowed despite his resolve. He felt the pull of that space, the unresolved tension it held. He forced himself past it, focusing on the task at hand. Still, his awareness sharpened, senses tuned for any sign of her presence. She did not appear that day, nor the next. The absence was a relief and a disappointment in equal measure, and the realization of that contradiction disturbed him deeply. Relief made sense, disappointment did not. Disappointment suggested expectation, and expectation was dangerous. He tried to remind himself of the boundaries that defined his world. He was there to work, nothing more. Words like beautiful had no place in his duties. They were indulgences he could not afford. And yet, once spoken, they could not be taken back. They existed now, altering the shape of things in ways he could not fully grasp. As days passed, the memory softened at the edges but did not fade. It became something he carried quietly, a private weight. He found himself more aware of his own thoughts, of how quickly they could wander into forbidden territory. He corrected them when he could, redirecting his focus to the tangible, the feel of fabric, the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of work. Still, moments of reflection crept in. He wondered, not for the first time, who he might have been if his life had taken a different path. It was not a question he often allowed himself to ask. The answer led nowhere useful, yet now it seemed harder to suppress. The brief exchange in the room had reminded him, painfully, that he was capable of seeing and being seen, even if the world around him denied that possibility. He thought, too, of her question, why? Why had he spoken? The answer he had given, that he did know. No, felt insufficient. In the quiet of his room, he considered it more honestly. Perhaps it was because the thought had felt true and immediate, unfiltered by fear. Perhaps it was because, for a moment, The roles that defined them had blurred, and he had responded as a person rather than a function. The idea frightened him, but it also clarified something he had long avoided acknowledging. The house continued its routines, indifferent to his inner turmoil. Tasks were completed, days marked by the same patterns. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, he felt a growing awareness that could not be undone. He was more careful now, not just with his actions, but with his thoughts, as if guarding a fragile secret. When he did see her again, it was briefly, in passing. Their eyes met for an instant, then broke away. No words were spoken. Yet in that fleeting exchange he sensed recognition, a shared memory neither of them had acknowledged aloud. It was enough to send a tremor through him, subtle but unmistakable. That night, as he lay awake, he understood that the moment in the room had not been an isolated incident. It was a crack, small but real, in the carefully maintained structure of his life. Through it had come questions he could no longer fully silence, about worth, about voice, about the cost of perpetual restraint. He did not know where those questions would lead, nor whether they would lead anywhere at all. He only knew that they existed now, and that knowledge had altered him in ways that could not be easily reversed. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, grounding himself in the familiar darkness. Tomorrow would bring work, as it always did. He would perform it with the same care, the same discipline. But beneath that discipline, something waited, an awareness that even in a life defined by limits, a single moment of honesty could reverberate far beyond its brief existence. The change did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, almost politely, disguising itself as coincidence and routine. At first he wondered if the tension he felt was merely the aftershock of his own fear, the mind's habit of inventing danger after narrowly avoiding it. But as the days passed, the house itself seemed to respond differently to his presence, as if it had taken note of something invisible and adjusted its balance accordingly. He noticed it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, resumed only after he had moved on. He noticed it in the subtle reassignment of tasks, small changes easily justified yet unmistakable to someone who knew the house's patterns as intimately as he did. He was sent more often to work alone, away from shared spaces, away from casual observation. Isolation was not punishment in the obvious sense, but it was a signal. The house was paying attention. He accepted these changes without protest. Protest was useless, and explanations were never offered to those in his position. Still, the awareness weighed on him. Each solitary task felt like an examination, every quiet corridor a test of his ability to remain what he had always been, unobtrusive, reliable, silent. Others noticed too, though they did not speak of it directly. A servant who once exchanged quick, knowing glances with him now avoided his eyes. Another, older and more cautious, brushed past him one evening and murmured a warning so soft it could have been imagined. "Careful," was all she said. He did not ask what she meant. He already knew. The house had its own ways of correcting imbalance. Sometimes it acted swiftly, decisively. Other times it waited, allowing unease to do the work on its own. This felt like the latter. No accusation was made, no reprimand delivered. Instead, he lived with the sense of being observed from a distance. Ants, measured against expectations he could not see. He redoubled his efforts. His work became meticulous to the point of obsession. He arrived earlier, left later, checked and rechecked everything he touched. If there were flaws, they would not be his. If consequences came, they would not be easily justified. This discipline steadied him, gave him something concrete to hold on to. Yet discipline could not erase memory. The moment in the room lingered, now transformed by context. What had felt spontaneous and human now seemed dangerous in retrospect, a spark in a place built to smother flame. He wondered how it had been interpreted, not just by her, but by the unseen mechanisms of the household. Words traveled here, even when spoken softly. He saw her rarely now. When he did, it was never alone. Others were always present, their proximity a reminder of boundaries reasserted. She did not look at him directly. When their paths crossed, her gaze passed over him as if he were any other servant, indistinguishable and forgettable. He told himself this was for the best. Distance was safety. Still, there were moments, brief, nearly imperceptible, when he sensed something, unspoken beneath that deliberate indifference. A pause before she turned away, a tension in her posture that eased only after he had gone. These were not acknowledgments he could rely on, nor meanings he could afford to assign, but they unsettled him nonetheless. One evening he was summoned unexpectedly. The message was delivered, without explanation, as such messages always were. His stomach tightened as he followed the familiar route, each step measured and cautious. He rehearsed his responses in his mind, prepared apologies he hoped he would not need. The house felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. He was led not to the private room where the moment had occurred, but to a smaller, more for Mal's space. The choice itself felt significant. He stood where he was told, hands folded, eyes lowered. Someone spoke to him about his work, praised its quality, noted its consistency. The words were neutral, almost kind. That, too, was unsettling. "You understand your place here," the voice said at last. "Yes," he replied, because there was only one answer that could be given. "There are expectations," the voice continued. "They exist to preserve order." "Yes." A pause followed, heavy with implication. He waited, heart pounding for the unspoken to be spoken aloud. It never was. "You may go." He left the room shaken, relief and dread tangled together. No accusation had been made, yet the warning was clear. The house had acknowledged the disturbance and chosen, for now, to contain it rather than crush it. He did not mistake restraint for mercy. It was strategy. From that day on, he became more careful than he had ever been. He measured not just his words but his thoughts, or tried to. He avoided spaces where chance encounters might occur. He kept his gaze lowered even when it was not required. He rebuilt the walls he had allowed for a moment to crack. The strain showed itself in small ways. He slept poorly. His hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. He grew thinner, his appetite dulled by constant vigilance. Those who noticed attributed it to overwork, and perhaps they were not entirely wrong. Overwork was safer than suspicion, and yet, despite everything, he could not undo what had been done. The consequences were not only external. Inside him, something had shifted permanently. He had learned that silence could be broken, and that breaking it carried both risk and power. The knowledge was dangerous, but it was also clarifying. He understood now why the house guarded its rules so fiercely. They were not just about control, they were about preventing recognition. He wondered, in rare unguarded moments, whether she felt the consequences too. Whether her own behavior had been corrected, her movements watched. The thought unsettled him. He did not want to be the cause of trouble for anyone else, especially not through something as fleeting as a sentence spoken without permission. Time passed, smoothing the sharpest edges of tension. The house relaxed, just slightly. Tasks returned to their usual patterns. Conversations resumed cautiously. It seemed, on the surface, that the incident had been absorbed into the structure of daily Lee, very reduced to a footnote. But he knew better. Some things did not disappear. They settled, waiting. The consequences of that moment had reshaped the invisible boundaries of his world. He lived within them now, conscious of their presence even when they were not actively enforced. He accepted this as the cost of what had happened. There was no room for regret that served no purpose. He focused instead on endurance, on preserving what little stability he had. If the house demanded silence, he would give it silence. If it demanded obedience, he would comply. And yet, beneath that compliance, a quiet understanding persisted. The house had reacted because something real had occurred, something that could not be fully erased by reassignment or warning. That realization sustained him in ways he did not fully acknowledge. It reminded him that he was more than the sum of his duties, even if the world around him insisted otherwise. The consequences, then, were not only about control and correction, they were about containment, of truth, of recognition, of moments that threatened to remind those within the house that roles were constructed, not natural. He carried that knowledge carefully, like a fragile ember hidden from view. Outwardly, he returned to being what he had always been, efficient, silent, forgettable. Inwardly, he lived with the awareness that even the smallest act of honesty could ripple outward, drawing consequences far beyond itself. It was a lesson learned not through punishment, but through restraint, and it would stay with him long after the house itself faded into memory. Time did what it always did in the house. It moved forward without ceremony, smoothing what it could not erase and burying what it could not forgive beneath layers of routine. Weeks turned into months, and the incident that had once felt like a crack in the world became, outwardly, a mem. Ori no one acknowledged. The house regained its rhythm. Doors opened and closed at familiar hours. Voices rose and fell in predictable patterns. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. Yet for him, the change was permanent. He learned to live with it the way one learns to live with an old injury, something that no longer bled but never fully healed. The sharp fear faded first, replaced by a steady caution that settled deep into his bones. He no longer replayed the moment every night, no longer woke with his heart racing at imagined consequences. Instead, the memory took on a quieter shape, becoming part of the landscape of his inner life rather than a storm that dominated it. He returned fully to his routines, and in doing so, he discovered something unexpected. The house no longer felt exactly the same, not because it had changed, but because he had. He saw more now, even when he pretended not to. He noticed the exhaustion behind the rigid posture of others, the small acts of resistance hidden in efficiency, the ways people clung to dignity in places where it was rarely acknowledged. These were things he might have noticed before without truly understanding them. Now they carried meaning, He was careful with that meaning. He did not share it. He did not let it show. He understood, better than ever, that survival here depended on discretion, and yet the knowledge itself gave him a strange sense of steadiness. It reminded him that he was not merely reacting to the house, but observing it, understanding it on a level that went beyond obedience. He saw her less and less as time went on. When he did, the distance between them felt settled rather than strained. Whatever tension had once existed had cooled into something neutral, almost formal. She moved through the house with the same composed authority as before, her life shaped by expectations different from his, but no less confining. He wondered occasionally whether she remembered the moment as he did, or whether it had been folded away among many other impressions, its significance diminished by time. Once, much later, their paths crossed in a narrow corridor. There was no one else around. Instinctively, he lowered his gaze, prepared to pass without incident, but as they drew even, she slowed, just slightly. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to invite conversation, just enough to acknowledge presence. "Your work has remained excellent," she said quietly, without looking at him. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. That was all. She continued on, and he did the same. The exchange was ordinary on the surface, insignificant to anyone who might have overheard it. But to him, it carried a weight that surprised him. It was not about approval, it was about recognition, carefully, contained, safely expressed. It was enough. He realized then that the lasting impact of that single sentence he had spoken was not the danger it had brought, nor the fear that had followed. It was the awareness it had awakened. He had crossed a boundary and survived, not unchanged but intact. The world had not ended. The house had not collapsed. Instead, it had adjusted, as rigid systems often do when quietly challenged. That understanding reshaped how he saw himself. He was still bound by the same rules, still subject to the same limitations. Nothing about his position had materially improved. And yet, he no longer believed that silence was the only form of safety. He understood now that silence was a tool, useful, necessary, but not the only one. There was power, too, in restraint, chosen consciously rather than enforced blindly. As years passed, new faces appeared in the house, replacing old ones who moved on or faded away. He remained a constant presence, valued for his reliability. Younger servants began to look to him for quiet guidance, sensing his experience even if they did not know its source. He taught them what he could without words, how to move unnoticed, how to listen, how to protect themselves. He did not tell them stories. He showed them through example. Sometimes, late at night, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the house. Not in detail, that would have been cruel, but in outline. A life where words could be spoken without calculation, where seeing and being seen did not carry risk. These imaginings were no longer painful fantasies. They were reminders of possibility, however distant. He understood that his moment of honesty had not changed the world, nor even the house, but it had changed him. It had confirmed something he had long suspected, but never proven to himself, that his inner life was not owned by anyone else, that no matter how carefully his actions were controlled, his capacity to recognize beauty, truth, and humanity remained his own. In that sense, the impact was profound. It gave him a quiet dignity that could not be taken away, because it did not depend on acknowledgement. It lived in how he carried himself, how he worked, how he treated others. It was present in his patience, his restraint, his refusal to become hardened despite everything. The house would one day belong to someone else. Its walls would witness other lives, other moments of tension and silence. He knew this, even if he would never see it. His own time there, too, was finite, though he did not know how or when it would end. That uncertainty no longer frightened him as it once had. When he thought back to the moment, the afternoon light, the stillness, the words spoken too freely, he no longer felt shame, he felt clarity. The sentence had been simple, almost naive, but it had carried a truth that neither fear nor consequence could erase. It had proven that, even in a life defined by limits, authenticity could surface, brief and dangerous and real, and that, he understood now, was its lasting power. He continued to make beds, straighten rooms, and pass through corridors as quietly as ever. To the house he remained what he had always been, a presence barely noticed, a function efficiently performed. But within himself, he carried the knowledge that he was more than that role. That once, in a moment of unguarded honesty, he had spoken as a human being rather than a shadow. That knowledge stayed with him, steady and unyielding, long after the echoes of that day had faded. It did not free him in any visible way, but it sustained him. And in a world built to deny such things, that quiet endurance was its own form of freedom.